Now you're going to develop a campaign of escalating tactics. And these are going to be tactics that are going to use the grassroots power you have to move your legislator. So we will give you examples of each type of tactic, and on the single payer school, you'll find links giving you more in-depth information about each specific tactic if you want to use those. To start with, you're going to download the campaign planning worksheet that we've provided. And on the worksheet, you're going to list out each of the tactics that you're going to use and a timeline for each tactic. Now, these tactics are going to be sequential, so you're only going to do one at a time. You're going to give yourself, a month to implement one tactic, or 6 months if you need it. And you're only going to use a tactic if the previous tactic has failed. So ideally, you're not actually going to have to carry out this whole campaign. You might get your legislator on board after using the first tactic. You might get them after the second one. But you want a contingency plan for if each tactic fails. Going back to our case study from Massachusetts, where we were trying to get Representative Ed Markey on board HR 676 as a co-sponsor, our campaign had about 4 tactics that we had lined up. Initially, we collected petition signatures from 100 constituents in the district, including some key folks working at large unions who had good relationships with the rep. Our next tactic was to organize a delegation office visit to his district offices. The third tactic, if that failed, was to leaflet outside of all of his district offices in the district. We also did a press release and some press work so that he ended up on the front page of all of the local papers just with our leafleting activities. And then our last campaign tactic, if all else failed, was to start a door-to-door canvassing campaign where we would ask people to call Rep. Markey and demand that he sign on to the single-payer bill. So now we're going to talk about the process of how do you choose the best tactics for your campaign. And to do that, we're going to talk about a few different categories of tactics that you may end up using. And these are going to include preparation tactics, sort of before you officially launch your campaign. We're going to talk about initial low leverage tactics that you start with in your campaign, then escalation to higher leverage tactics. And finally, we're going to talk about a couple of special categories, including positive reinforcement tactics, as well as militant tactics, aka civil disobedience. So to begin with, before you even start your campaign, you may want to take some preparation steps. Now, these are tactics that are not applying any direct leverage to your legislator yet, but this is going to lay the groundwork for some of your later organizing. Examples of preparation tactics could involve things like preparing a report, a memo, or a fact sheet on the state of healthcare in your district. It could be things like developing a story bank of people who are directly affected by the healthcare system in the district, or perhaps drafting a petition or an open letter and starting to collect signatures from individuals and organizations. The next step is going to involve using lower leverage tactics, and these are all going to involve private communications between you and your legislator. So you're not applying any public pressure on him or her yet. Now, the point of starting off this way is that it gives your legislator the chance to do the right thing and to sign on to the bill before you've sort of put the public spotlight on them. But it also gives you a chance to hear whether they have any reservations, and you can start a dialogue with them and maybe address some of their concerns. Now, a quick note here, even though you're not yet applying public pressure or leverage, you want to use tactics even at this stage that show the grassroots power that you do have. Some examples of lower leverage tactics are things like organizing a district office visit, and this is a tactic you're going to have to use at least once in your campaign and probably multiple times. Some other examples include delivering the petition or the open letters that you've been collecting signatures on previously. Or you could organize a call-in day where you phone bank and you ask your activists to call into the legislator on a particular day and ask that they support the single-payer bill. Now, if these private tactics haven't worked and you've given your legislator every chance to do the right thing and you've addressed all of their legitimate concerns and they still haven't signed on, at this point, you want to start applying some public pressure and using higher leverage tactics. Now, there is a huge range of public pressure tactics that are available to you, and you need to think broader than just the Indivisible Guide, for example. Although that's become very popular lately, the Indivisible Guide only recommends 4 tactics. 2 of them involve private communications with your legislator, and 2 do involve public pressure, but they're fairly low leverage. They're very viable options as part of your campaign. So for example, you could submit op-eds and letters to the editor and papers that you know that your legislator is going to read, but that doesn't apply a whole lot of pressure or leverage on your legislator. Likewise, attending town hall meetings, which is the signature tactic of the Indivisible Guide, is a great tactic to be part of your campaign. Likewise, you could bird dog your candidates if they're attending other events in the district during recesses or if they're campaigning. But you can also use higher leverage tactics. For example, you could hold informational pickets outside of all the legislators' district offices, like we did in the case of Ed Markey. You could also organize your own public hearings and invite your legislators to attend, which was extremely successful when Vermont organizers were trying to win single-payer healthcare in their state. You could also hold accountability sessions, which is a very high leverage tactic that's described in the Organizing for Social Change book. Now, I want to talk about a couple of special categories of organizing tactics. First, let's talk about positive reinforcement tactics. Now, particularly for legislators who are already supporters, maybe they're already co-sponsors of your bill, but you want to move them into greater leadership roles, a lot of the public pressure tactics that we've been talking about probably wouldn't be appropriate. You may not want to occupy the district office of your legislator if you just want them to take on greater leadership roles. In those cases, you probably want to turn more to tactics that incentivize your legislator to do more by rewarding them instead of punishing them with negative publicity. Examples of positive reinforcement tactics might be to invite your legislator to speak at some public events where you're putting them in front of some larger crowds. You could ask them to co-author an op-ed or a letter to the editor with you when healthcare is really in the news. Or you could pull together a broad group of supporting organizations and ask them to sign on to a Dear Colleague letter or to add a section to their campaign website about why they support single-payer healthcare, whatever your leadership goals are. Finally, I want to talk about militant tactics and civil disobedience. These are tactics that are going to significantly disrupt your legislator, or sometimes they'll disrupt the public with the goal of forcing the public to pay attention to the issue. A few notes here. You really only want to use militant tactics when you have tried everything else first. If you jump right into civil disobedience, you risk alienating your legislator right out of the gate, and you can also limit the number of individuals and organizations who are willing to participate in your campaign. In particular, groups that have more privilege can sometimes afford the risk of taking on militant actions more easily, so that may be a dynamic you don't want to create. Now, it's also important to be aware that there's a difference between militancy and power. You get your power from having a broad base of support among affected communities. So patients, providers, business people, all the folks who are really negatively impacted by the healthcare system. And these are communities that your legislator needs support from in order to gain legitimacy and also to be reelected. Now, militant tactics that use that power, a broad base of support, can be extremely powerful and effective, and they can sometimes be your last resort when you're stonewalled through absolutely everything else. But if you adopt militant tactics as a small marginal group without power, you're just marginalizing yourself. And one final note is that militant actions should really be carried out by those who are directly affected by the healthcare system. If you have folks who do not have powerful, compelling stories about why this is a morally urgent cause, carrying out radical actions, again, you can sort of lose more support than you gain. And just to give a few examples of more militant actions, you can creatively disrupt a hearing or a public event in all sorts of different ways to sort of delegitimize them. Occupations and sit-ins, of course, are a common form of civil disobedience. And there's just a whole range of nonviolent direct action that you can draw from the history of social movements in the United States and other countries. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of final tips that apply to all the different categories of tactics when you're trying to come up with something. Now, my first tip is to choose tactics that use the type of power that you have. So, for example, if you have a core of activists who have powerful stories about how they've been directly affected by the healthcare system, you want to choose tactics that have those activists at the center of them, and you want to message with their stories. Or let's say that you have strong support among municipalities, from mayors, city councilors, aldermen. You can turn that support into a type of action that highlights the impact of the healthcare system on local cities and towns. Or let's say that your strength is that you have a really broad coalition behind your campaign. In that case, you want to craft actions that visually demonstrate the broad spectrum of support that you have from all sorts of different communities in the district. And my last tip, as with all of these planning activities, is that it's really best to develop your campaign and choose tactics brainstorming with a broad group of activists so you can draw from their experiences in different social movements. If you get really stuck choosing tactics, we have a couple of resources linked to in the Single Payer School that have long lists of possible organizing tactics, so you can sort of browse through them and get some new ideas. Or you may just want to call an experienced activist from another social movement. Sometimes that can help you think outside the box. So your final step is just going to be implementing your campaign and actually organizing it in practice. And to walk you through that, we're going to use our case study from MARKEY in Massachusetts, and we're really going to look at that in depth.